My name is Aaron Scholl. I'm the Managing Director and General Counsel at the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI for short. It's a pleasure to have you with us. We are a public policy research institute, often referred to as a think tank, and we look at cutting edge issues at the edge of public policy and technology, and this is certainly one of them. This webinar series is a collaborative effort with the Artificial Intelligence Institute at the University of Waterloo, Dr. Bessma Momani, and Jean-François Bélanger from the Political Science Department at the University of Waterloo. This series has been funded through the Department of National Defense Mobilizing Insights in Defense, or a MINDS grant. And today's webinar is the third in the series, with more happening over the course of 2021. We will cover different topics and debate and discuss issues surrounding artificial intelligence, warfare, bringing together both technical experts and policy experts that are working in this area. We will share links to our events in the chat page with you, so you can explore the upcoming topics and speakers. As part of the initiative, CIGI will also be publishing a series of essays in 2022 that will focus on providing assessments for the near, medium, and long-term policy implications for the increased deployment of artificial intelligence and autonomous systems in military, defense, and security strategies. A couple quick housekeeping notes. We want this to be as engaging as possible with the audience, so please use the Q&A function. And I genuinely mean that. I think a lot of people are pretty much webinared out by this point, and the best ones are always ones where it is an engaging process with the speakers. So at any point in time, just please use the Q&A function, and we'll try and get to as many of the questions that you have as possible. And just in terms of order of operations, we'll spend roughly the first hour listening to our panelists, and having a bit of a moderated conversation about AI, conflict, and international law. But we have saved 30 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. So please do make sure you get them in. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the event page of the series later in the week. So lastly, I would like to take a moment to introduce our speakers, both of whom are phenomenal. We have Rebecca Croutoff. She is an assistant professor of law at the University of Richmond School of Law, where her primary areas of research include technology law, international law, and torts. Dr. Croutoff's written work explores questions stemming from the iterative relationship between law and technology, often in light of societal changes sparked by increasingly autonomous systems, artificial intelligence, cyber operations, robotics, and the Internet of Things. She is interested in the ways both domestic and international legal regimes respond to and shape technological development, particularly in the armed conflict context. Dr. Croutoff earned a BA cum laude in English with a minor in mathematics at Sonoma College, a JD at Yale Law School, and a PhD at Yale Law School, where she graduated as a member of the first class of PhDs in law awarded in the United States. You know what? I didn't even realize that, Rebecca. That's amazing. Congratulations.
We're the guinea pigs. Yeah.
Yeah. You know what? I'll stop there with your, like, if I actually went through your biography in detail, it would take the entire session. Suffice it to say, Rebecca is eminently qualified, is a great speaker, and knows all about these issues. So thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Michael Horowitz. Michael Horowitz is the director of the Perry Worldhouse and Richard Perry Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He's the author of The Diffusion of Military Power, Causes and Consequences for International Politics, and co-author of Why Leaders Fight. He won the 2017 Carl Douche Award given by the International Studies Association for early career contributions to the fields of international relations and peace research. He is published in a wide range of peer-reviewed journals and popular outlets. His research interests include the intersection of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, robotics, and with global politics, military innovation, and the role of leaders in international politics and geopolitical forecasting as a model. He is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and holds a PhD in government from Harvard University and his BA in political science from Emory University. So again, Michael, it's a pleasure to have you with us too. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. So now let's jump right in. I'm going to turn to Rebecca first. Rebecca, I know you've got some comments that you wanted to make to kick things off. So Rebecca, over to you, please.
All right. Well, thank you, Aaron, for this opportunity, and to the University of Waterloo, obviously, all the different components and all the different people who got together to organize this incredible series. I'm really looking forward to to being in the audience for the other talks and reading all of the eventual papers that are going to come out of it. All right, so I was going to start with a brief overview of artificial intelligence, just to make sure that we're all grounded and in the same space on that. Apologies to those who are already intimately familiar with this. Then move on to some of the legal debates regarding the use of AI in armed conflict right now, with a particular focus on the accountability question. All right, so starting with basic introduction to AI. There's a tendency to move the goalposts when attempting to define artificial intelligence, right? People used to say that we'd have artificial intelligence when a computer could beat a human at chess. And then when that happened, they said, oh, no, that's not it. It's when a computer can beat a human at Go. And then when that happened, they're like, oh, no, that's not it. And it's sort of so on and so forth. Rather than like attempting to define completely what it is, I think it's better to think of artificial intelligence as an umbrella term that covers a variety of information processing techniques that are used to perform some goal-oriented task. So this includes search engines, navigation systems, or medical diagnostics, a whole host of different systems. There's sort of two main categories of types. One is a more sort of stable decision tree that's built on a series of if-then statements. If this, then ask that question or do that thing. And this kind of artificial intelligence is best if we know what kind of decision-making process we're trying to replicate and operationalize at scale. So if a customer has X complaint, a chatbot will give them these three options, and so on and so forth down a decision tree. Then there are machine learning systems, which are best when we want to develop some sort of independent problem solving or identification ability. So if you really want to identify cat videos or tumors or come up with unexpected winning Go moves, use machine intelligence to get at it. And both of these different types of systems have distinctive strengths and vulnerabilities. Also, when talking about AI, it's worth noting that it can sort of also be defined along another axis, namely on how flexible it is. There's weak or narrow AI that can do one task really well, like playing chess or identifying tumors. But it's brittle insofar as it can't really do anything else. You can't switch it over to something else and have it and have it do that well. And that is pretty much all artificial intelligence today. Then there's strong or general AI, which is good at multiple tasks, right? Can play chess and identify tumors. And this is sometimes described as human level intelligence. And that doesn't really yet exist, but it's what many researchers are working on now. How do you make AI systems that can do more than one thing really well? And then finally, there's artificial superintelligence, which is something that surpasses human intelligence. And right now that's purely speculative. It's really fun to think about and play mind games with. It's not really happening in the near future. Okay, so AI and armed conflict. Like pretty much all industries right now, militaries are incredibly excited about the possibilities of artificial intelligence. And they're thinking about, how can we use this to improve weather prediction? How are we going to use this to improve predictive maintenance? What other systems can we use AI in to streamline, to minimize costs, to speed up various tasks? But I think most people here are mainly concerned about the use of AI in militaries regarding decisions to use lethal force. And there are two main areas in which AI is going to be used that are going to affect the use of lethal force in armed conflict. One are AI-based autonomous weapon systems, and two are AI decision assistance. So starting with autonomous weapon systems. Autonomous weapon systems are systems that are capable of selecting and engaging a target without human intervention, and they do this based on data and gathered data in the field, as well as pre-programmed constraints and decision-making trees. I want to clarify from the beginning a few common misconceptions. One, when I talk about autonomous weapon systems, I am not talking about drones, or at least not most drones that are in use today, because they often have a human in the loop, and so they're semi-autonomous, at least at present. I'm also not talking about sci-fi systems like the Terminator. First of all, the Terminator is a semi-autonomous system. Its target was selected for it. And personally, my favorite fictional autonomous weapon systems are Lieutenant Commander Data and R2-D2, both of which had the ability to use lethal force without human intervention. But in general, autonomous weapon systems are not futuristic weaponry, right? There are already over 30 states that are fielding systems with varying degrees and levels of autonomy, and there's a ton of state interest in further research and development. Many of the autonomous weapon systems that are in use today can be analogized to other types of weapons, and they're governed by the same relevant international rules that govern all means and methods of warfare. But in a few particular situations, there's no real appropriate analogy, and the existing tech-neutral rules don't really provide sufficient guidance for answering the questions raised by autonomous weapon systems. And I'll come back to this point a little bit later in the talk. But I said there are two main types. So one is autonomous weapon systems, AI-enabled autonomous weapon systems. The second are going to be AI-enabled decision assistance. And while there's been a lot of policy and scholarly focused on AI-based autonomous weapon systems, at least relatively, there's been not nearly as much discussion about how AI decision assistants are going to affect the use of lethal force. I think arguably these non-lethal systems that are going to impact or affect or alter military decision-making, they might have even more of an impact on the use of lethal force than any individual type of autonomous weapon systems, because they're going to play a variety of different types of roles. They're going to gather information, they're going to crunch and analyze that information, they're going to assess threats, they're going to be alert systems, they're going to recommend targets, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, they're far less governed by any relevant international law, especially to the extent that they're non-lethal systems themselves. Instead, they're mostly going to be regulated on a more ad hoc basis by states' different internal policies, like the US Department of Defense's current ethical principles on the use of AI. I think there's going to be an explosion of scholarship and conversation on AI decision assistance and their impact on the use of lethal force in the near future. All right, so wanted to touch on a couple pertinent legal debates right now on the use of AI in armed conflict. There are a gazillion different ones, but I'm just going to boil it down to sort of two main headings. One of the most prominent ones right now is whether or not autonomous weapon systems should be banned. The Campaign to Stop Killer Robots has been advocating for a ban since 2013. There are ongoing international discussions and meetings and events around it. I've long taken the position that any debate about whether or not we should ban a weapon also has to engage with the question of whether or not we can ban a weapon. And so a little while ago, I conducted a historical study of different successful and unsuccessful weapon bans, where I looked at everything from the prohibition on the use of crossbows to prohibitions on the use of chemical weapons, to the ban on permanently blinding laser weapons. And I distilled out factors that seemed to affect whether or not the ban ultimately was successful in achieving its objectives. And I then evaluated autonomous weapon systems against this and, used these factors and applied them to autonomous weapon systems. And I found that most of the factors either were irrelevant for autonomous weapon systems, they wouldn't really sway things one way or the other, or weighed against the possibility of enacting a successful ban. So I'm pretty pessimistic about the utility of pursuing a ban, across the board ban on autonomous weapon systems. But while I was doing this research, I found that states are often very, very willing to regulate the use of, or the research into, or the distribution of, or the proliferation of weapon systems that they're not willing to ban outright. And so that brings us to the second level regulatory debate, which is, Is the law of armed conflict, also called international humanitarian law, and all of states' policies around it, is that sufficient to govern the use of autonomous weapon systems? Or do we need some new, more text-specific rules or regulations or norms to address particular problems that are raised by autonomous weapon systems? And there are a lot of people in both camps. Interestingly, the ICRC, after sort of staying silent on the issue for a while, the International Committee of the Red Cross recently just took a public stance arguing that, well, actually, we need, not only do we need new rules, right? We need new specific rules regarding the use of autonomous weapon systems. And I could not personally agree more with that overarching idea, though I differ on some of the specifics. But I think the extant tech neutral rules are incredibly useful, and they're very useful as a floor, but there's also a real need for new rules and legal clarification to address some of the new quandaries and the new challenges that are raised by autonomous weapon systems. So just to throw out a couple of examples, it's really not clear. It's clear that we need legal review for all weapon systems before they're fielded to ensure that they can comply with international humanitarian law. It's not clear what that's going to look like for an autonomous weapon system. Like, what are going to be the standards or the requirements for it? What type of legal review is going to be required for it? Even something as simple as, is in-field learning going to be permitted, right? That's a question that's not answered by any of the existing law out there, because the existing law out there did not anticipate the possibility of a weapon system that could learn and change and adapt in the field. And then finally, one of the questions that's interested me the most is the question of which entity should be held accountable when an autonomous weapon system or other AI-enabled system takes action that results in unpredictable harm. And I've spent a fair amount of time focused on that last question, and so I'm going to outline it a little bit. Article after article after article bemoans how new technologies like artificial intelligence or autonomous weapon systems are going to create an accountability gap on the grounds that no one individual can legitimately be held liable when these systems act in unpredictable ways that cause harm. So international humanitarian law, also known as the law of armed conflict, it consists of many different rules that are designed to minimize, not prevent, is really important, but minimize the likelihood of causing harm to civilians. And so these rules, while critically important, still permit a lot of unintended civilian harm, due both to collateral damage and also to accidents. And mainly when there's an accident in armed conflict, no one is liable. We have no accountability mechanism for that. So even when AI systems or autonomous weapon systems are used lawfully in compliance with all the rules of existing international humanitarian law, they're sometimes going to take action that results in accidents, that results in civilian harm. And what I think is really interesting about them is they highlight this risk of accidents, because not only are autonomous weapon systems subject to a lot of the traditional sources of error in armed conflict, they actually create new manifestations of those different kinds of error. So let's just run through a couple. First of all, there's weapons errors. And this is a familiar concept, right? All weapons are subject to malfunctions due either to poor design or poor manufacturing. Autonomous weapon systems, or any system that's built on code, is going to be subject to that, as well as subject to bugs, which are programming errors that cause unanticipated results, and also subject to what's called normal accidents, taking that from normal accident theory, which are errors that result from unpredictable interactions between elements in a complex, tightly coupled system. Now, clearly, bugs can have lethal effects in armed conflict. In 2007, a software glitch resulted in the South African anti-aircraft cannon misfiring during a training exercise and actually killing 9 soldiers and wounding 14 others. Also, any code-based system introduces new vulnerabilities. And those new vulnerabilities can be hacked, they can be gamed, or they can be otherwise exploited by adversaries. So that's weapons error. Then we've got user error, which arises whenever anyone is operating with poor training or in a high stress environment. In addition to usual user errors, AI systems are also going to introduce new types of user error because there's a lot of evidence that human operators are subject to AI-specific user error that we need to be aware of as militaries increasingly incorporate AI decision assistance and use autonomous weapon systems. Most importantly, I hope one of your takeaway messages from this is that putting a human in the loop will not solve all the problems associated with artificial intelligence. It may even create brand new ones. So for example, human beings have a documented tendency to defer to the decisions of automated or artificially intelligent systems, even when they're told they're not 100% accurate, more than they'll defer to the decisions of systems that aren't automated or artificially intelligent and are 100% accurate. And this trait is commonly referred to as automation bias. And you can also think of it as overtrust in a system. And there are plenty of examples in both the civilian sphere and the military sphere of overtrust resulting in accidents. So one of my favorites, there are at least 4 instances of people following their GPS navigation directions and driving cars into ponds, into lakes, into bays, and even into the ocean. And that just exemplifies how much human beings are willing to trust automated systems, sometimes against their own better judgment. Obviously, in armed conflict, this overtrust can have deadly consequences. So in 2003, on 3 separate occasions, the US Defensive Patriot system misclassified friendly planes as ballistic missiles, and operators ordered the system to engage the perceived threat, despite having information available that contradicted the system's assessment. This is one of many examples of overtrust resulting in accidental harm and human death. Additionally, I think a lot of people's immediate response is, well, let's just train users better, train them to undertrust the system. But that's not a silver bullet. If users undertrust systems too much, then they lose their value, and we're risking overinvestment in useless or potentially even harmful infrastructure. The captain of the USS John McCain, for example, quickly learned not to trust his glitchy new navigation system, and so he often used it in backup mode. Unfortunately, in this case, his undertrust actually created new risks unknown to him, because the manual mode disabled a bunch of built-in safeguards. And so this contributed to a collision that killed 10 sailors and injured 48 others, which was the US Navy's worst accident at sea in the past 40 years. Meanwhile, as we delegate different tasks to machine intelligence, we're losing those skills. This is known as skill fade, and it's been documented already in pilots in domestic aircraft. And I know that I am certainly much worse at navigating since I've gotten a GPS system, though I do have yet to drive into a body of water, and I'm going to hold on to that. But as a result of this skill fade, we as human beings are generally worse at identifying when something is going wrong, right? So we're worse at monitoring the system, and we're also worse at taking over when something does go wrong. All right, so weapons errors, user errors. Next one is data errors. Over and over again, incomplete or inaccurate data results in bad decisions in warfare. Most accidental civilian harm recently has occurred because civilians have been misidentified as combatants, usually due to poor human intel. But the more that militaries rely on AI, big data and AI decision assistance to determine who might be hostile, who might be a threat, who might even be a lawful target, the more likely we are to see mistakes due to errors baked into the training data and baked into the algorithms themselves. And this was wonderfully detailed in a new Unity report called Known Unknowns that goes through all the different types of data errors that can manifest. Finally, we've got communication errors, another common source of error in armed conflict. Namely, when talking about human-in-a-loop system, I just want to note that any system that requires communicating between a human intelligence and machine intelligence risks something being lost in translation. And we've seen this before, again, in the civilian context. Part of what made the 2009 Air France flight disaster so tragic was that it should have been relatively easy for the pilots to recover from the plane's aerodynamic stall. But every time they took steps to do so, there was an autonomous alert system that blared at them, panicked them, and made them think that the one thing that they were doing that could have saved them was actually the exact wrong thing to do. And as a result, the plane crashed, killing all aboard. So, okay, sorry for all of the examples that are so painful, but I think they exemplify the real risks here. And artificial intelligence, autonomous weapon systems, they're going to increase the risks of different types of weapons errors, user errors, data errors, and communication errors. And importantly, under the law of armed conflict, when these errors occur, when they result in accidental civilian harm, no one is liable. That's, to me, the main accountability gap. So, as I said, the use of artificial intelligence in armed conflict raises numerous different legal issues, many of which are questions of first impression. The thing I want to emphasize about the accountability gap is that this isn't actually a case of technology creating a new problem. Rather, this is a situation where technology has made an old problem far more salient, right? It highlights this old problem, brings it into sharper relief. Namely, there is no accountability mechanism for most unintended civilian harms in armed conflict. Individuals who intentionally target civilians or otherwise commit serious violations of international humanitarian law, well, they can be held criminally liable for war crimes, both internationally and domestically. But with accidents coming from the use of artificial intelligence or autonomous weapon system, no one acts with the requisite mens rea, the required mental element, to be held criminally liable. Meanwhile, states that engage in internationally wrongful acts, like failing to punish members of their military who commit war crimes, they can be held responsible under the law of state responsibility. But if the act itself is lawful and results in accidental harm, it's not an internationally wrongful act. It doesn't trigger the law of state responsibility. And so, in short, what AI and autonomous weapon system, the risks of error, what they highlight is that no entity is accountable for the harmful consequences of lawful acts in armed conflict. I just want to say that again, because that goes against most of what we're accustomed to in domestic legal regimes, right? If there's a lawful act that results in unintended harm, under the law of armed conflict, no one is accountable. And that is unique to the law of armed conflict. And so instead, all unintended civilian harms lie where they fall, which is on the innocent civilian victims. Now, I do think there's a silver lining here. By throwing this problem into sharper relief, by highlighting this issue, tech-enabled conduct highlights the need for more accountability mechanisms. And I hope will drive discussion around how to create more accountability for harmful consequences of lawful acts in armed conflict. And I have my own proposal for this, and other people are developing others. But to me, that is what is one of the issues that I think is most interesting arising out of the tech-enabled conduct of AI and autonomous weapon systems. All right, looking forward to the discussion. Thank you all.
Well, no, thank you for that. That was a really, really insightful set of remarks. And there's a few areas that I do want to pick up in when we get to the questions, but I'll turn first to our colleague, Michael Horowitz. Michael, over to you, please.
Thanks a lot, Aaron, and thanks to you, to the Center for International Governance Innovation, the University of Waterloo, and Rebecca, who just made my job easier in some ways by laying out so many of the important things, but harder as I rapidly have crossed things off of my outline for what to talk about, because now I need to figure out what I'm going to say. And Let me start by actually going a little bit broader than I think Rebecca did. And that I think that when I think about AI and the way that it will impact international politics, and I agree completely with the way Rebecca talked about the sort of definitional issues involved, I think about AI as a general purpose technology, as something more like the combustion engine or the steam engine or electricity than like an individual widget, even a dual use technology. And I think that's one of the things that's made some of the international discussion of AI governance, particularly in a military context, challenging, because we're not used to talking about general purpose technologies and what their regulation and use and impact will look like. We're used to talking about specific applications of technologies or specific components of technologies. We're used to talking about lethal autonomous weapon systems or blinding lasers or nuclear weapons or tanks or, maybe, some kind or fighter and, fighter jets or stealth as an example of a technological component. General purpose technologies, because the most prominent ones that impacted our world that we can think of are really in some ways like a 19th century phenomenon in a lot of cases, putting aside something like computing, we've spent a lot less time thinking about them lately, but I think that that's really important because general purpose technologies have both short-term and long-term consequences on global power that I think are worth keeping in mind when we think about AI and the different mechanisms through which AI will influence international politics. You have a short-term vehicle where the advent of a general purpose technology can be adopted by militaries in various forms, and sort of speed and adoption can maybe give you an advantage on the battlefield or a disadvantage if there are too many accidents. But you also have a long-range mechanism where general purpose technologies feed into economic capacity, societal resilience, all sorts of questions that impact and then feed back into military power in a way that impacts what the balance of power looks like over time. And I think AI is an example of a general purpose technology. And I think that that's also important in this context because these kinds of technologies it's not just about their battlefield applications. Most applications of AI, even by militaries, will not be battlefield applications. There'll be applications in everything from algorithms designed to help with logistics to algorithms designed to help in planning internally, questions of, say, hiring and promotion, to maybe to algorithms that deal with things like decision aids for commanders, and then finally there might be some small subset that fits into that lethal autonomous category that Rebecca did an incredible job, frankly, of talking about. So I scratched that off my list as well. But I think it's worth considering that what we're talking about when we talk about AI can just differ so much depending on the types of applications. And it can differ in terms of the relative importance. It can differ in terms of where in the broader military operations it is. And it can differ in terms of how risky we think issues such as automation bias, which Rebecca mentioned, are. And that some applications might be more susceptible than others, to the extent that we think that processes like cognitive offloading, when you drive your car off the bridge because Google told you to, that processes like cognitive offloading might not be sort of uniformly likely across applications, depending on how people think about them. So that's one thing that I think makes this question of AI applications and how they influence power, how they influence military use really complicated. The fact that AI is a general purpose technology. Second issue, and I want to tread lightly here as not a lawyer, are some of the moral and ethical questions about varieties of military application, or a philosophy professor, frankly, moral and ethical arguments about military uses of AI. And most of this debate has happened in the context of lethal autonomy. But I think in some ways that's, I mean, a shame is probably not the right way to say it, but I would say limiting, insofar as if the important thing we really need to understand is what are the things we actively want humans to be in control of versus what are the things where we're okay delegating control to a machine. The question is, when are we comfortable with that? When do when does it undermine human dignity to not have a human making a call? And now outside in the civilian world, there are questions like about, say, real estate loans, prison sentences, all sorts of areas where we know that there's bias. Rebecca talked about data bias, where there's bias built into data that can lead to suboptimal outcomes. But that's less kind of what I'm talking about here. More what I'm talking about are the sort of moral and ethical arguments against using AI for important military decisions and in favor. And it is easier in some ways to contextualize, I guess, some of these in the battlefield context. On the con side, you have, say, the right for a human to decide that you should die, as opposed to, to make that call, as opposed to a machine making the call. Now, is that really right? Like, I don't know. I mean, something like the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots would probably say yes. I'd be curious what Rebecca would say actually about that. You also have a variety of moral and ethical arguments that, some people have leveraged in favor of something like autonomous weapon systems. The idea that they don't get tired, they don't get angry, they won't make mistakes. They won't essentially make mistakes due to human fallibility. But this raises in some ways the question of when we make choices about whether to use AI in different military contexts, what the reference set should look like. Should the reference set be in a vacuum? How does this system perform? Or should the reference set be, how does a given system perform relative to how things are done now? Which I think generates some slightly different questions and ways of thinking about accountability gaps, about responsibility, and some of these issues. And I would start with questions of reliability. And say you have a completely human-directed system at present that, say, is about 75% reliable, at achieving a task, whether the task is accurately identifying people for promotion, or identifying adversaries on the battlefield, or firing a weapon. Suppose the human is 75% accurate. How good does an algorithm have to be before we think it's okay to use that algorithm? Is it just as good? Is that what we want? If the algorithm is 75% and the human is 75%, then all right, like that's okay, because if we've already decided that the human is good, basically, like by that I mean it's a responsible legal choice to do that, then why would the machine not be good if it's just as reliable? Is less okay? Because we're taking the ideas, we're deploying machines instead of humans to reduce labor costs, to take humans off the battlefield, to decrease the risk to human life. Maybe not on the adversary side, but certainly on the side deploying a system. And so, frankly, even if the system is less reliable, that's okay. Or is the answer actually we want more reliability? That if the human system is 75% reliable, that's pretty good. And so to switch to a machine and generate some unknown parameter risks of accidents, maybe, or to delegate decision-making away from a human, that actually the degree of reliability we want in an algorithm be much higher than 75%, maybe it should be 85, maybe it should be 90, whatever. My point is not to give necessarily the right answer to that. And in fact, I think the right answer might vary depending on the task, right? Like there are some cases where the costs to being wrong might be lower. It might vary based on the task. The right answer might vary depending on whether what we're talking about is whether it's legal or whether it's a good idea, which are not necessarily the same thing. And it might vary depending on the relevance of the military activity. In that, are we talking about the use of force, or are we talking about something else? And remember again that most military applications of AI will not be on the battlefield. But I think that this question about how reliable you want things to be looms large, and it also is why I think one of the most important debates about AI now concerns, how you do testing and evaluation. And Rebecca raised the question of, on-board learning. If you have a machine learning algorithm that maybe has been tested and validated, but it's out there in the world learning as it does whatever it does, how do you verify that learning is occurring in a way that is acceptable based on, how your military is set up, or how your military views its obligations under international humanitarian law? These are actually really difficult questions. And I think different countries are likely to resolve them differently. Let me move on to another point here. I think different countries are likely to make very different choices about the ways that they think about using AI, depending on both how capable they think those systems are and how they view their own sort of military necessity. Classically, when we think about military innovation, for example, rising powers tend to be more willing to take risk when it comes to thinking about emerging technologies in some cases, because they have less to lose. They're willing to take more risk in thinking about what emerging technologies might look like and how they might be deployed on the battlefield, precisely because they're not the best in the world already. A classic example of this, of course, is the US and the Japanese innovating with carrier warfare and carrier aviation, while the British were still very focused on battleships prior to the outbreak of World War II. Now, how does this matter? I mean, forget about the history. How does this matter in the AI context? I think this gets to broader questions about US-China strategic competition, US-Russian competition, and the way that Russia and China in particular view advances in AI as a potential way to disrupt American conventional military superiority, and think about investing in AI as a way for them to potentially catch up to or leapfrog the US in some capability areas. Related to this is that the logic of AI works for almost any country in the world. If you have an advanced economy and a small population, like say Israel or Singapore, there's a logic to heavily investing in AI because you're substituting capital for labor. If you're a wealthy, developed democracy, like say France, there's logic in developing AI because to the extent it lets you, again, substitute capital for labor, and you sometimes have trouble recruiting and retaining in your military, applications of algorithms can make a lot of sense. If you're an authoritarian state like Russia or China or others that doesn't trust your people to begin with, because otherwise you wouldn't be an authoritarian regime of that sort, then the extent that artificial intelligence allows you to centralize control in the hands of a few sort of more trusted people, that can be really attractive. Essentially, there's something in this for everyone, which is also one reason why I think a variety of traditional arms control approaches, when thinking about AI, could actually be really challenging. But I do want to present, so the next point I want to make is a more positive one, and that I think there's a real opportunity to use a tool that we primarily associate with the Cold War, confidence building measures, as a way to try to buy down shared risk in the international community surrounding AI. Now, confidence building measures tend to be somewhat less formal, somewhat less legalistic than traditional arms control, although the definitions of these things aren't exactly precise, but they include things like transparency measures, notification measures, sort of all the way up through, you can see things like the original US-Soviet Incidence at Sea Agreement from '72, sometimes described as a confidence building measure. But what confidence building measures are designed to do is exploit the shared interests that states often have in cooperation. The challenge with a lot of ban proposals or arms control proposals can be that they try to have states focus on cooperating in areas where they don't have shared interests. Say, imagine you have one country where if you froze the military status quo and no one ever used AI, it actually helps them from a relative power perspective. And another country that views AI as how they're going to, the way that they're going to militarily catch up with their neighbors. They actually don't have the same inherent interest in regulations of AI. But they might have shared interests in two areas in particular. One, decreasing the risk of accidents, which Rebecca talked about in detail. and 2, preventing miscalculation. Since if you're going to fight, obviously you should fight because you chose to, not because you were sort of drawn into it somehow. And so confidence building measures work best, like arms control in general, when you have shared interests. And in the AI context, I think that this question of accident reduction and stopping sort of catalytic escalation from the speed of machine learning applied on the battlefield, making off-ramps to war harder, that's really a place where there's a lot of opportunity to, I would say, make a big difference in building cooperation. Let me give 2 examples that I've written about with co-authors like Paul Share and Lauren Kahn and Casey Mahoney. First are confidence building measures surrounding the application of early warning systems for specifically involving strategic command and control, so things involving nuclear weapons. For states with secure second strike capabilities like the United States, the case for, say, automating early warning or a fully autonomous sort of command and control system, it's not really a great argument for it. After all, if you have secure second strike capabilities with humans heavily engaged in, heavily involved in the loop, then those kinds of systems like the Soviet dead hand system during the Cold War just generate risk. And it's a good example of a place where my own country, the United States, could potentially think about taking the lead, because the US system works well and America has secure second strike capabilities. And so it's a case where even if others didn't reciprocate, it might be something that the US would be pretty happy with anyways, but there's certainly the opportunity to get a lot of allies and partners potentially on board, and maybe Russia and China as well, to agree on humans being fully engaged in decisions involving early warning, communication of launches, et cetera. Now, that doesn't necessarily solve the issue that Rebecca raised about automation bias, because to the extent that somebody could be in the loop, but still cognitively offload to an algorithm, because they treat essentially a probabilistic algorithm as perfect, like as a calculator, you still could have sort of the risk of escalation, but you at least could buy down that risk potentially a bit. Second area where I think you could use confidence building measures to decrease risks associated with military uses of AI comes from what called an autonomous incidence agreement. Essentially an autonomous systems equivalent, and equivalent's the wrong word, autonomous version of something like the Incidence at Sea agreement, where countries deploying varieties of autonomous military systems during peacetime. I mean, it's tough to make the case for some of these things during wartime, because during wartime, countries are going to want to be secretive for all the reasons why countries want to be secretive during wartime. But during peacetime, before the war has started, having stable notification procedures for when countries are deploying systems sort of out there, on the water, in the air, underwater, that have particular levels of autonomy, so that everybody knows what they're dealing with. And those kinds of measures, because they might decrease the risk of miscalculation, might help you know if something malfunctions, like, oh, that's that algorithmic system, like maybe we should take a step before thinking about that, what just happened as a deliberate attack. Might be able to decrease some of the risk of escalation that comes from the possibility of operations at machine speed. So there are 2 sort of areas where I think confidence building measures could potentially make a big deal in decreasing the risk of inadvertent escalation, of accidents associated with military uses of AI. Now, the last thing I'll say, and then I will stop because I really want to open it up for Aaron for questions, is that I think you actually have some pretty large, like Rebecca and I agree on like a lot of this stuff, but not all of this stuff. I'll be curious if we can get into some of the areas where we don't agree. I say that like not like 100% positive what those are, but we'll find out. But I think you have some large differences in opinion out there, though, when it comes to how we should think about the principal risks associated with emerging technologies like AI. And those relate to questions of what I would call pacing or speed. And by that, I mean, you have some people out there, and I would say a former US Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bob Work, would be an example of this, that worry that their countries will be too slow in adopting various uses of AI for military purposes. That military bureaucracies will be slow and conservative, and this means that a leading power like the US might miss out from an innovation perspective. So thus, what you need to do is speed up adoption. Alternatively, there are others, and I'd put varieties of say research by folks at OpenAI in this bucket, maybe somebody like Alan Defoe's at Oxford's research on this, et cetera, that worry about going too fast, principally, that are less worried about militaries being too conservative, and instead are really worried about militaries getting testing and verification procedures wrong and about accidents. Essentially, militaries that don't know what they're doing with AI for varieties of reasons that have to do with both inherent properties of AI and questions surrounding training, program managers, et cetera. And thus, the principal risk is that militaries will be too fast to adopt unsafe uses of AI, which they'll then deploy in crisis situations, potentially to disastrous effect. So I think a key question we really need to be thinking about then is basically, how do we get to the Goldilocks situation? Is there elements of both of those arguments that are certainly sensible? So what can we do? Keeping in mind, Rebecca is essentially like a little bit of Rebecca's like, LOL, there's nothing we can do about accidents perspective on this. Sorry, Rebecca. That what can we do to get to more of a Goldilocks place when it comes to military applications of AI and the speed that they're deployed to ensure that when they're deployed, it occurs in a safe and responsible way, in a way that doesn't, disadvantage a military because they're just too far behind the curve by the time they get around to doing it. And with that, let me stop, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you for that, Michael. Again, a really insightful set of remarks. And I couldn't make this up, but my Perry Worldhouse pen, actually, as I was writing notes, I looked down and I realized I'm using the pen that you gave me last time I was down there. So that's not the point of this conversation. I wanted to pick up on something, though. There was a thread in between both what you and Rebecca were mentioning. And I don't want to oversimplify it, but is there a chicken and egg problem here? Like, do you, in your mind, is technology creating a new problem to be solved, or is new technology reminding us of old problems that we've had all along? Maybe another way of thinking about it is there something fundamentally different here, or is this the same, just a new version of it? I'll turn to Rebecca first and then over to Michael. Rebecca, please.
Yes. I mean, this isn't, I don't think this is an or kind of situation, right? I think this is an and situation. New technologies, I'm going to come at this from a legal perspective because I'm a law professor. That's what I do. But new technologies mess with law in a host of different ways, right? Sometimes they create new applications problems for law, in that we have an object, a thingamabob, like, how do we regulate this thingamabob? We have certain tech neutral rules, like if you use that thingamabob to batter someone, you can be held criminally liable for it. But what if this thingamabob allows you to do something that you were never able to do before, right? That's a new problem, might not be quite the right word, but like it's a new challenge, it's a new question. And then simultaneously, new technologies expose the assumptions that laws are built on, right? And sometimes these assumptions are explicit and sometimes they're implicit. Right now, our laws regarding weaponry assume that weapons can never engage in independent action, right? And autonomous weapon systems expose that assumption, and that's why there's a whole bunch of questions about, well, what analogy is right for them? Are they more like weapons or are they more like combatants? And which rules should we apply to them? Imagining a sort of robot soldier here, not how most autonomous weapon systems, which are going to manifest as cyber systems. And so it's both. It's new problems and highlighting old ones all together. And so yes.
No, it's a fair point. And the other thing, of course, is that many of the laws that we have on the books that ostensibly are being used to govern this area, many of them were written before computers were even invented. So it's a fair point. Michael, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Rebecca's about right on that. Like if what we're talking about is part of this is to what extent, what is the relationship, and frankly, Rebecca, as a law professor, we know better than I do, if we think about maybe international humanitarian law obligations here between process and outcome. If what we care about most, and obviously we care about both those things to some extent, but we could easily end up in a situation where you have varieties of autonomous military systems that are doing tasks in a different way than humans did them, but accomplishing very similar goals and with similar levels of reliability. From an outcome perspective, it looks very similar, but from an say like an accountability perspective, as Rebecca's initial remarks suggested, things can get very confusing. And as a political scientist and a policy person to some extent, rather than a lawyer, I actually tend to think about some of these accountability issues as existing but solvable, because the way that I think that there are two ways practically that a lot of countries, and by countries here really, by the way, to be clear, I mean sort of advanced democracies, probably, like how China's going to solve what I'm about to talk about. Like, honestly, I don't know. In that, one, is they'll solve accountability just by making rules. We will create accountability rules for military systems with varieties of levels of artificial intelligence. And then as real world events reveal the issues with those rules, we will change the rules. And we will iterate over time until there's something that people are pretty comfortable with. And that's not satisfying, probably, like from an international law perspective. But I think that that's actually probably pretty realistic as to what would happen. Like if you had a weapon system that, say, survived, that came out of 3000.09, the Autonomous Weapon Directive in the United States, and there were accountability questions. Whatever U.S. military service was deploying that weapon would definitely make up rules of accountability, and they would believe that those rules were good rules. And if those rules didn't work for some reason, they would then change the rules. It's not like there wouldn't be an accountability system. The question is just how exactly it operates. And so that's, one area where I think these things will get made up in some ways. The second is when we think about what human control over military systems means. And that given a lot of the definitional issues that Rebecca cited, both with regard to AI and with regard to autonomous weapon systems, it's plausible for me to imagine a world where militaries essentially define the point of human control as the point where they are confident beyond a certain level in an algorithm. And that, say, if they think that this algorithm is extremely predictable, and so it's about as reliable as, say, launching a cruise missile with some advanced guidance, then, if we think that human control is sufficient over the cruise missile, we'll say that human control is sufficient over that algorithm, whether it's a sort of weapon or not. And if we're not confident in testing and verification for it, then we'll say it's not effectively under human control. That will end up with essentially a like it when you see it definition of human control, where lots of militaries are defining it essentially for themselves, and thus whether it works or not will kind of depend on how good their systems are. And which, again, not very satisfying legally, I strongly suspect, but it's easy for me to imagine a world in which that's where we got politically. Over.
No, I appreciate that. I want to come back to this thread about advanced democracies and rule structures. Matt Waxman at Columbia Law School wrote a good article on the way that strong states interpret existing rules in their own interest and the way that they advance new conversations about rule structures, norms, again, in their own interest. And it's not surprising that the strong will try and bend the world to their will. So it's improbable that all countries are going to view AI the same way. And so thinking about international law and geopolitical conflicts, what does it mean in your mind to have kind of Russia and China likely on one side thinking about it in one way, and then you have your point about advanced democracies maybe thinking about it in a different way? If we're looking to create a normative framework, how problematic is that there's likely quite a bit of daylight between major powers moving in this space? Michael, I'll go to you first on that and then over to Rebecca. And also, just as a side note, we made big promises about having a question and answer with the audience. So please, folks in the audience, add your questions in now and we'll get to them. But Michael, what are your thoughts on that?
So my thought here is that I think it depends on what our reference point is, how disappointed we might be. And that if the reference point is the sort of go-go 90s where, it seemed like we could get the world together to the whole world could, potentially agree on a bunch of different things, then the prospect of, say, a alliance of democracies and like-minded states on the one hand, and then maybe sort of a Russia or China or others on the other hand, looks very disappointing. If the reference point is the Cold War, then what would we expect? We would expect, in some ways, like slightly lower common denominator norms. It's back to that shared interest point about confidence building measures that Russia and China could get behind as well. And then further development of sort of rules of the road and responsible behavior by countries interested in those things. If so I think if our reference point is, say, I don't know, like the 1890s, then we would actually, then the number of actors, shrinks way down. And, really this is about actually negotiations between a smaller number of states, like the most likely users, essentially, of a technology trying to sort of build norms, which is not how most international discussions have gone over the last few decades. So I think that there's some challenges here then in trying to figure out what norms mean in a world where some of the most significant defectors from anybody's norms are going to be, like really powerful countries that are most likely users of some capabilities. But I do think the context here sort of matters. And if the goal is norms built around areas of shared interests, then global cooperation may be more possible. If the goal is cooperation that goes far beyond that, then you're going to be talking about a narrower group of states, at least given the ongoing great power competition.
Thanks for that. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Rebecca, too. But it strikes me, part of the problem as well, if we're talking about creating normative structures, much of the technology is being developed in secret. And so everyone's racing to advanced capabilities, and no one's speaking publicly about what they have and what they're prepared to use, as well as there could be a discussion about publishing military doctrine around this. But Rebecca, what are your thoughts?
I mean, just to follow your point, the issue about secrecy is exactly the same as what's plagued the cyber operations discussion, right? Is trying to figure out what are the rules of the road for cyber operations when it's difficult to attribute them, when states don't take responsibility for them, when they act through non-state actors in various ways. We're going to see a lot of those same problems, questions, issues, challenges manifesting here. And Michael, I love being in discussions with you because I always learn so much from you, and I particularly appreciated your point about how all these different states have interests in developing and building AI, right? And how there are these very different reasons for that interest, but they all propel states towards this R&D. And I think one of the goals of norms in international law is always trying to harness, okay, what are those shared interests then? And as much as states might take very different views on what constitutes reasonable human control or meaningful human control or appropriate human judgment or X human Y, insert your words, I think there is a lot of shared interest in minimizing unintended conflict escalation, in minimizing accidents where possible, and trying to find the Goldilocks balance between speed of development and safety. And so I think to the extent that norms can focus on those, or conversations around developing norms can focus on those, that's going to be some of the most productive areas for norm and legal development. Michael did kept mentioning about like things being disappointing from a legal point of view because, oh, there'll be a law and then it won't work for this or that reason and they'll change the law. That's not disappointing, right? That's legal evolution, right? That's what happens all the time. And what's, I think, so fun and interesting about this area of discussion is that there's a recognition that some of the existing rules don't quite work. And so there's an opportunity here to figure out what the next rule is. But as much as there's malleability in rules and the opportunity for revision and change, there's also a lot of path dependence that gets set. One of my favorite ways of thinking about international law comes from Ona Hathaway and Scott Shapiro, who said that international law isn't most effective when it bans a state from doing something that it wants to do. It's most effective when it changes incentives for doing certain actions, right? When it makes it more attractive or less attractive to engage in certain activities. And they were focused on the question of going to war at all. But I see a lot of the potential for rulemaking around AI as being able to change incentives. Like, do we want to make it more painful for states to field accident-prone weapons? Like, I think yes, and I think that will change incentives more generally. So yeah, I think the concept of confidence-building measures, particularly around areas of shared interest, is a huge space for development. And as always, anytime where states see their interests as being in opposition or being a zero-sum game, that's going to be a very difficult space for international law in general.
Michael, you look like you wanted to follow up on that.
I thought the point Rebecca made was, look, all the stuff Rebecca said was smart. Like the point that Rebecca made about how, what I described as a legal failure, she described as a legal success, I think is actually like really interesting in this context. Because, and sorry, the word actually probably is like not, whatever, forget I said actually, is very interesting in this context. Because it calls out something that I think that we sometimes miss in these conversations where in that if we think about the formation of, and part of this gets to the difference between the way we talk about norms in political science, I think, versus the way that we talk about norms in the policy world. If we think about norm development the way we do in political science as a process, where you have entrepreneurs that build sort of shared norms over time and try to convince others to come on board, and then that's eventually codified in law, sort of sometimes not, then you have stages essentially of development that can reshape the way that the international community over the course of a generation thinks about a particular issue in a way that increases stability. But if we think about norms instead as sort of like a binary and like, all right, either like the norms work or they don't, then that puts us in a very different situation. And so I think what the sort of point that Rebecca made is really smart because of the way it highlights that the way how the real world development of what norms and rules of the road when it comes to military applications of AI, that even when it comes to international law, which we tend to think about as like, oh, either there's the treaty or there's not a treaty or something, that even that is a process that where you have revealed behavior over time that will then shape what's seen as appropriate.
Yeah, that resonates. And we've actually got our first question coming in from the audience, so I'll turn to it now. It says, isn't it more difficult to make laws when we don't fully understand what the ramifications are of these developments in AI? So, and maybe I would add I'd add something to that too. Part of the reason why I was really happy to do this series with the Waterloo AI Institute is because there's a gap between policy makers and their understanding of technology, and so bridging that gap is important. So I'd be keen to hear your comments on the question that was asked, but also when you're thinking about how we're going to develop these frameworks. Is there a capacity issue too in terms of the people that are going to be asked to write the laws and policy? Do we need to educate people around technology more fundamentally? So maybe I'll turn to Rebecca first on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is always a question with regulating technology, right? That the skill set of someone who becomes a rule maker and is not necessarily going to be a technologist. And so there's always a concern of the entities that are making the rules not knowing enough about what they're making rules about, as exemplified in the US by the congressional hearings with Facebook. But I think that doesn't mean, oh, we need to defer entirely to industry either, right? There's a number of tech neutral goals and this gets at and processes. I think Michael made an important point in highlighting both that process and outcome are important components here, that are worth identifying and clarifying, and that people can see that can manifest in ways that you don't need to be a technologist to understand the risks or the concerns. And then finding that balance is going to be the challenge. I think it's also worth recognizing that rules don't need to just be prohibitions, right? A lot of times rules can be incentive creating, or they can be standard setting, and that all of these are different ways of guiding what technological developments seem worthwhile or beneficial. And so it's possible to have laws or rulemaking that guides things in a productive way, as opposed to just saying, like, don't do that thing over there.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll turn to you, Michael, on the same question. But when you were mentioning it, Rebecca, like one of the things that struck me is the speed of the technological development. So if we're trying to put in place guardrails or rule structures, you know, laws of war, like, yeah, sure, bullets got bigger and bombs got bigger, but it was kind of the same thing. And the speed of the technological change that we're witnessing right now is likely unprecedented. So when we're constructing rules, is there something different in the way that we need to approach it? Because look, no one has ever accused international lawyers of moving too fast on anything, right? So, you know, even to get the rule structures in place is going to, like, the tech will have moved, you know, 20 miles down the road by the time we get a rule structure in place for what we're dealing with now. So, Michael, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that kind of that suite of issues.
So I think that I tend to think that when it comes to, if we're talking specifically about creating law around sort of military uses of AI, that I don't know, I mean, I've always been of the opinion, and again, as not a lawyer, don't listen to me, that the law of war likely contains most of what we need from an outcome perspective to think that, you know, uses of force, that a country is using force in a way that is, you know, safe and responsible and legal, and that the larger risk in some ways, or there is maybe not large risk, but there is a risk in over regulation in emerging technology areas, because what if you get those things wrong and you constrain yourself too much, and then your adversaries aren't constrained by something? You know, what if in attempting to avoid, you know, risk X, you limit development of a certain type of technology or technology in a particular area, and that's great, but then none of your adversaries don't follow that, and you only, because of the secrecy that we talked about earlier, you only discover too late. You know, how do you protect against those kinds of challenges? Well, you protect against those kinds of challenges by cheating yourself. And, you know, like now, like, are we really better off if, like, the only countries that are actually following the rules are ones that weren't going to do anything in the first place? Like, maybe, like, whatever, like, you can make, like, there's like probably there's like an empirical social science argument about that, but I don't know. I mean, I would tend to think that we want to be careful in tailoring potential regulations that are too narrow and designed to fit, like, very specific technological features that could change and whose reliability could change over time. And that, you know, what we think of today is like really edgy, from like, oh, could an algorithm do that reliably? Like 15 years from now, like maybe not, but it's harder to roll some of that stuff back.
Yeah, please.
Oh, I was just gonna say, legally, it's sort of funny. The XKCD has some great cartoon about, you know, throughout history where different people have written like technology is changing too fast and we can't keep up, right? That this concern is a longstanding concern, and that's not to say it doesn't have a lot of validity. It does. But over time, legal systems have developed some structural mechanisms for addressing this concern about not being able to regulate fast enough after the fact. One is to have more tech-neutral regulations, right? This is what most of law of war is things like you can't use weapons that cause superfluous injury or suffering. That's going to apply to swords or autonomous weapon systems, right? It's tech neutral. The issue with tech neutral regulations is that they leave a lot of power in the hands of the interpreter, right? And a lot of opportunities for the state fielding weapon to argue, no, this thing doesn't cause superfluous injury or suffering, right? Or this thing isn't inherently indiscriminate, or whatever the tech neutral rule is. And so the flip side of that is law comes up with mechanisms for answering those questions after the fact. Sometimes that's designating an authoritative interpreter and saying like, no, this entity has the right to say what is or is not superfluous injury or suffering, or this entity has the right to say what is or is not that thing. And sometimes it's including opportunities for legal change, right? For reassessment. My favorite one is what's called a technological sunset, which is a text-specific provision that sort of self-destructs when it no longer applies to a given technology. Now, the negative side of that is that then leaves an absence, right? A lack of regulation. But the plus side is it forces reconsideration of the issue on a regular basis.
Michael, did you want to pick up on that? There's another question that just got dropped into the chat that I'll turn to, but did you want to come in on Rebecca's point?
No, I thought it was great. Let's turn to a new question.
Okay, sounds good. So the question comes in. It says, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the impact of functional norms on the regulation of autonomous weapons, or norms that are being developed through ongoing practice of increasing autonomy in existing systems. So, I mean, I wonder if what they're getting at here is like a little bit of the customary law stuff. So countries learn by doing, rule structures emerge from practice. So they're looking for a question or an answer on the impact of functional norms on the regulation of autonomous weapons. Michael, did you want to go first, and then I'll turn to Rebecca?
Sure, and I'm actually gonna cite something that Rebecca's done on this. So that kind of about this, and that like I actually think that this is a case, if what we're talking about is functional norm development, or sort of norms revealed through practice, then I think that this depends in some ways on the like how we think about I mean, this is a place where the definitional debate matters, essentially, about what constitutes an autonomous weapon. And that if you believe that there are no autonomous weapons that have been deployed beyond, maybe, like close-in weapon systems, like deployed on naval ships or military bases with like automatic modes or something, then essentially the answer is that there hasn't been, because you actually haven't had militarily relevant autonomous weapon systems put anywhere, so it's hard then for like for practice to develop. If on the other hand you think about I don't know, loitering munitions, really advanced cruise missiles, other sorts of things, and Rebecca and I was going to say, and Rebecca has a law review article about some of this, like as autonomous weapons, then you probably could make a stronger argument about what existing norms look like. And I would actually assert that it would suggest that international humanitarian law is actually like functioning okay in terms of dealing with these kinds of systems. Because if you think that these systems already have been deployed, then I think this is actually like a the kids are going to be all right story. But I don't know, Rebecca, since I just cited you, what do you think?
I mean, you stated my argument, so I agree with you. All right, I think I think there are autonomous weapon systems in use right now that are being used in compliance with international humanitarian law, and that shows that yes, international humanitarian law can work. I think, as Michael made the point at the beginning, is autonomous weapon systems, that phrase encompasses so much, right? And so many potential applications, and so many, potential systems that it's not clear that they're going to, that, the current laws are going to work for everything. And that's sort of what people are anticipating and arguing over. In terms of norm development, I think one of the interesting legal debates that's happening right now is this question of whether or not the concept of meaningful human control being required, whether or not that's already a norm that exists, that's been an inherent assumption within international humanitarian law, or whether that's a new norm that needs to be created to address and regulate autonomous weapon systems. And so some folks are arguing that it's just been an unspoken assumption that's already there. And so it has credibility as a norm because all state practice exemplifies it. And other people are saying, well, it's not been there, but we need it. And still others are saying it's not been there and it's not clear that we need it. And so that's one of the live legal debates right now.
It's a good point. We've got about 10 minutes left. We got one additional question, so I'll turn to that question. If anyone in the audience does want to ask a question, we're kind of entering the lightning round now. So the question comes in: doesn't the development and use of autonomous weapon systems reflect the tendency of states to conduct military operations and interventions rather than war in the classical sense, which may make it difficult to regulate on these systems on the international level? So I think maybe what they're getting at there is this underlying current that tech makes it a little bit easier, and maybe there's a bit of a discussion about kind of hybrid warfare or gray zone conflict, the kind of stuff that doesn't rise to the level of traditional armed conflict, such that it'd be captured by IHL. But I don't know, Rebecca, did you want to take a shot at that first?
Yeah, I think right. So often new military technologies are force multipliers, and so it's not just this question of gray zone warfare, things that are happening, below the armed attack threshold, but are still arguably uses of force or interventions. But also the fact that many of these new technologies, there's a fear that they're going to empower non-state actors, right? This whole conversation, we've really been talking about states being the major players, and that's a sort of classic international law IR assumption. But the reality is that there's a host of non-state actors ranging from international corporations to armed groups, right? To a whole bunch of other ones that are going to be empowered in various ways by AI generally, and by particularly, I think people are concerned in this conversation by the use of autonomous weapon systems. Sasha Radin had a great piece on this. I think it was called Army of One. And so that's just like a looming problem, right? That we see that's already been manifesting in the cyberspace, but with cyber operations, but is also a potential risk in the kinetic space with autonomous weapon systems.
Michael?
I think that that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I guess I'm not sure we differ. I essentially don't. I'm not sure why existing wouldn't necessarily address this kind of issue. Essentially, I'm not sure we need, and by that I mean if there are problematic elements of fighting in gray zone conflicts, or problematic elements of fighting in operations other than war, sort of, et cetera, those would seem to me to exist whether or not you have autonomous systems, varieties of artificial intelligence, et cetera, deployed. I mean, as to the question of whether all these emerging technologies will make war more likely, this argument's been out there for a long time. There's not a lot of great evidence for it so far, I think, besides like maybe the idea that like the world could essentially be just like at a persistent low-level cyber attacks, or will be sort of constant. And so in that, everybody always probing each other's systems with, some degrees of non-kinetic escalation along those fronts. So like maybe that's an argument about like war getting easier. But, think about, there was a lot of fear when the US started deploying uninhabited platforms, drones like the Predator and the Reaper, that somehow this was going to make war easy. And I think the empirics haven't necessarily borne that out, and certainly in terms of the way that soldiers have thought about it. So I think I get the, you said that that's the concern. I get the concern, but I think it's a little too soon to tell.
Fair enough. So we got about 5 minutes left. Maybe we'll kind of turn to some closing comments. Rebecca, I'll go to you for your kind of closing thoughts. What in your mind are the 3 things that you want the audience to walk away with after this conversation with Michael? And I'll turn to Michael and then we can wrap up. But Rebecca, please.
I hadn't put together 3. Let's think. I think one main one is is that I think a lot of people want to solve the problems raised by AI and autonomous weapon systems by putting a human in the loop, right? If we keep a human involved, then we can sidestep a host of different problems. And I just don't think that's a nuanced enough analysis. I think a lot of times the issues raised by artificial intelligence, the risks raised by artificial intelligence will not be mitigated necessarily by having a human in the loop and may even be exacerbated. And so there's one thing I skipped over is there's a host of reasons why states want to develop and use artificial intelligence, right? There's a host of potential benefits associated with it. I kind of skipped over that and went straight to the problems, but there wouldn't be any reason to talk about the problems if there wasn't something to balance and that there's a host of benefits. But just knowing that the solution to the problems is not necessarily going to be putting a human in the loop. Accidents will happen. I think we need better accountability mechanisms for them. And I don't have a 3rd thing right now.
No worries. Michael, please.
Sure. I mean, I would start with this notion that I think, AI is a general purpose technology, and thinking about it that way is important for framing how we think varieties of applications of AI will impact the battlefield, conventional military power, international law, et cetera. And that, we spend a lot of time talking about laws here, about lethal autonomous weapon systems, but most applications of AI are not going to be laws. They're going to be across the waterfront for how militaries, design, train, operate, et cetera. And, we can't just think like, all right, we're dealing with the laws issue or not dealing with the laws issue. It's like, thus, like this is done. I think that these are general purpose technologies, that AI is a general purpose technology, which will have both short-term and long-term consequences for economies, for societies, and for militaries. Second thing I would say is that the applications, I think that there's a logic for everyone in acquiring AI, and that this matters when we think about the probability of international regulation and the type of international regulation that's likely to emerge. And that since everybody from Israel and Singapore as smaller countries, to Russia and China as competitors, to the United States, to countries in Western Europe, et cetera, heck, even Canada's investing a lot in AI. This is not something where you could pass some sort of international regulation and the world's going to be like, oh yeah, all right, we're just going to stop. The multitude of potential applications of AI, even for countries that say are skeptical about lethal autonomous weapon systems, or not skeptical about lethal autonomous weapon systems, or whatever, illustrates that that military applications of AI are going to be an important part of how militaries operate, and we need to take into account those varied motivations for countries in thinking about what potential solution sets should look like to decrease risk. And the last thing I would say is that I'll go back to something I said in my opening remarks, which is that I do think that a confidence building measures approach focused on areas of shared interest, such as decreasing the propensity for accidents, miscalculation, inadvertent escalation, et cetera, is the most likely type of vehicle for building broader based international cooperation, because it makes these issue spaces more concrete in ways that could help different types of states all get behind cooperation. Thanks.
Super. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Rebecca. I've really enjoyed the conversation. It was a pleasure chatting with you. I found your remarks insightful, knowledgeable, and just really engaging. So thank you for participating in the event. To those members of our audience, if you would like to watch this again or to share it with your colleagues, the video will be posted on the event page for the series by next week. The next webinar in this series is on July 15th. I'll ask the organizers to put a link in the chat with some more details. So if you want to follow the series, you'll be able to do that. And so thanks again to Michael and Rebecca, and thank you to our audience members for participating. It was a pleasure to have you with us. Enjoy the rest of your day.